Good morning, and I think it's time to start the second lecture, that it is about specifically the interbank market, especially seen, or exclusively seen, from the point of view of networks. And I think all of you knows that the recent global crisis, that it's recent, but I mean, it is lasting since many years, started essentially in 2007, at least the onset, when BNP Paribas was limiting the withdrawals from three of its products. And this started a long period of instability that affected a lot the relationship between different, originally Americans, and then the impact was spreading all over the world. Several financial institutions, starting from BNP Paribas, Bear Stearns, Lehman Brothers, and so on and so forth, that have AIG, have triggered a lot of macroeconomic activity. This is the Fed funds rate that started around 5% and then reached zero or negative values, and this raised this crisis put in evidence the role of the interbank market in as a channel for contagion of financial weaknesses or financial stress or financial instabilities in the system. But as I said, I mean, my main view will be in terms of networks. So yesterday there was, let's say, a pretty general introduction. So today we will just consider one system, one prominent system, which is the interbank market, and we will see the way different disciplines have contributed in the modeling. In the modeling and in the analysis. In fact, indeed, a large part of my lecture will be about the analysis and the empirical characterization of the interbank market. So, the interbank market was investigated with tools of network science indeed before the crisis, at least since 2004. The first study was by this group of scholars from Austria, Stefan Turner, Michael Boss, they and colleagues. They considered the banking network of Austria. And they saw that there were a lot of linkages in terms of reciprocal lending and borrowing over a given time scale. In the interbank market, the time scale, the most basic time scale is just the overnight time scale. But there are also other maturities. And at that time, in 2004, I mean, the first analysis, the focus was on the topology, as we saw yesterday, of the network, just to have information concerning what was the topology of the network. So this work was, in a sense, a pioneering work, and other work started later concerning the analysis of other systems, the European electronic market, EMID, done by Cardarelli, Iori, and colleagues, and the Fed wire market, or just a system, done by Kimmo Soramaki and collaborators, and then others continued along this line. So, before we go into the detail of the empirical modeling and of the problems related to the empirical modeling, let's see how indeed the theoretical modeling has been evolved. Again, the first study is essentially published in 2000. The first, at least the model that the first model that described it in a sufficient detailed way. The system is this. Several authors are using this Heisenberg and Noah model, in which you have indeed that the bank is linked to other banks by a network, by a series of interlinkages, in which you have liabilities and assets that you share with the others. So, as we have seen yesterday, you have nodes, and these nodes are banks, and you have links between pairs of nodes. These links could be present or absent, and at a given time period. And in general, you have a matrix P of liabilities. This matrix could have up to n times n elements. The element Pij, when it is greater than 0, represented the payment due from bank I to bank J. So this bank here has to pay at a given maturity this amount here to this bank here. And this bank here has to pay to this other bank here this amount at the maturity of the loan. Then there are also other obligations outside the network. And a bank has also globally assets outside the network because, for example, the bank is receiving the payment of some, let's say, loans that they have provided, and they also have liabilities because, for example, they receive a deposit from individuals or firms, and they have to give back this amount at a given time or on demand. So there are relationships which are interlinkages inside the banking sector, and then there are interdependencies with the outside system. So in general, the net worth, so in this stylized description, the net worth of each bank is the sum of assets that could be assets obtained inside the interbank market, an asset coming from outside, plus in an algebraic sense, the outside liabilities and outside interbank liabilities. So when this quantity here goes at or below 0, due to the fact that, for example, the banks is not able to obtain the necessary interbank assets, this means that the bank can go bankrupt unless a bailout or some external action will occur. And then, due to that, there will be an effect not only on the bank itself, but there will be an effect inside the banking system and outside, of course, the banking system with all this interaction. So, and then a lot of studies have been done just to see how the contagion, how the impact that you can have, you can observe in one or more than one banks which are in the interbank market evolve or just impact other banks, and then extend within the system and through and with the interaction with outside, also outside the system. There are, in general, two main channels. The first channel is just the most obvious one, the spillover or domino effect. This is just the spreading of the financial distress. So you have that this bank here has problems, so the banks stop the payment, and this impact at least this other bank here. So, so this is a direct contagion, and for example, the stress test and the type of study that are frequently done just use this first order impact. But you have also a second order impact, which is related to the fact that let's imagine that this bank is in distress. Then the bank is trying to use part of the assets that they have just to counterbalance or just to, let's say, obtain the liquidity needed. But doing that, they are forced to make a kind of fire sales on their portfolio. And when they do that, the mark-to-market value of the portfolios is typically strongly affected. And when this is done, there could be an indirect interaction between this bank and other banks, which are occurring, the interaction which is occurring through the similarity of the portfolio. So due to the fact that they can have overlapping portfolio, so they have no direct relationship in terms of payment through the interbank market, but they have a similar profile of the portfolio or similar composition of the portfolio, and due to that, the value of the portfolio change, and then some action of this bank will impact other banks which are not directly connected in terms of interlinkages, but they are connected in terms of similarity of the portfolio. So this is another channel. Typically, it is not so simple to put together the two things, because one is related to direct obligations that you observe between pairs of banks, and the other is through similarities of the portfolio that you observe between portfolios of assets of different banks. The first study about the domino effect is probably the study of Guy and Capadia, which was published in 2010, and this is just a simulation of the contagion of this channel here. And this is done, you see, by assuming a random interbank network. So in this model, you imagine that you stress a certain number of banks, and these banks are essentially homogeneous. So again, this is something that we saw yesterday. It's a quite strong assumption, because typically typically complex system and complex network are almost always heterogeneous. So, and the topology of the system is assumed to be as simple as possible, in the sense that the authors assume that they just have a random interconnection. Why they assume that they have a random interconnection? Because this is the case when, let's say, analytical modeling is simpler, and also numerical processes are simple. So for the sake of simplicity, they start with the most basic network modeling, and then the only parameter of the network is essentially, as we saw yesterday, the average degree, which is just controlling the connectivity, if you remember, the size of the giant component. And of course, this is effect of contagion are observed when this average degree is bigger than 1, as we saw yesterday. And they also put a capital buffer to all the banks, and as a function of the capital buffer, and as a function of the average degree, they estimate the expected number of defaults. So when the capital buffer is low and the average degree is high, then you have a large number of defaulted banks when you have a strong shock. but when you have enough capital buffer, then what you observe is that there is a certain number of banks which are affected by the contagion, but then the effect of the diversification diminishes the probability of the default, and then you will observe a maximum value just at a finite value of the average degree. So this was the first study. It's clearly an idealized modeling, and it is not taking into account second-order effect like this one here. And starting from this, a lot of other works have been done in this direction, in the direction of modeling systemic risk in the interbank market, and by putting topic of by considering the aspect of heterogeneity, indeed the modeling and the analysis progressively has considered the topic of what is called the detection of systemically important financial institutions, the one which are taking the role of in a sense, making more probable the impact of the two channels of contagions. I will not review all this work, but rather I will try to convince you that this modeling is, or the analysis of the system is quite complex, and the empirical characterization of the interbank market is indeed needs a lot of careful attention due to the fact that the system itself is heterogeneous, and we will see the role of heterogeneity, which is important, and due to the fact that data are extremely difficult to obtain, and also within central banks, the control of and the access to data could be problematic. So let's move on the empirical side. What is the topology? Guy and Capadia used the random network assumption, and already, what was already known at that time was that the random graph was just a very crude approximation of the modeling. And indeed, in the first study, Bose and collaborator proposed to describe the topology of the system in terms of a scale-free topology. We have discussed it briefly yesterday, the scale-free distribution, which means that the degree of the probability density function of the degree of the nodes of the network is a power law distribution. So this is one option, but the other option is to model the interbank market in terms of what is called a core periphery structure. So what is a core periphery structure? Yesterday we didn't discuss about the core periphery structure. It is a concept that originated in social networks. Again, there is there is a flow of ideas that is moving from different disciplines, and this concept was first raised in the study of national elites and collective action done by this author in the 70s, also in the interlocking of directorates of companies, in the scientific citation networks, and also in some particular system like a system studying the proximity among Japanese monkeys. So what is the point? in core periphery, you have essentially two classes of nodes. Some nodes that are highly interconnected among them, which are then defining what is called the core of the system, and another set of nodes which are interacting with this core, with one or more than one element of this core, but not among them. So these are the nodes which are defining the periphery of the system. In sociology, this was formalized originally by these two authors, Borgatti and Everett, and essentially, in terms of the adjacency matrix, when you have a core periphery networks and you classify correctly the nodes of the core as the nodes which are belonging to the core, and the nodes of the periphery as the nodes which are belonging to the periphery, then you can order your adjacency matrix. You remember the structure of the adjacency matrix yesterday, in this form here, such that you observe a block which is constituting the core of the system, and then you have the periphery where the elements are interacting with of the periphery are interacting with the elements of the core, or with some elements of the core. For example, 5 is interacting with 1, and 6, 7, and 8 are interacting with 2, 8 and 9 are interacting with 3, and then, for example, this 5 is interacting with 1 and 4, and in this example, and 6 is just interacting with 2. There are variants of the core periphery interaction. In this case, the number of interaction between the periphery and the core is not fixed. Here it is a complete interaction of the element of the periphery with all the elements of the core here. So 5 is interacting with all the elements of the core. So, but this part of the model is not completely defined. So you can, in both cases, you describe this as a core periphery structure, and then you can formalize and give indicators of the core periphery by counting the number of by counting the distance between the real system and this idealized form of the adjacency matrix. There is no unique way to have an indicator of the degree of the core periphery. So this problem is related to the problem of characterizing an adjacency matrix in terms of a block model. This is again something that originates in sociology, in which there is a long tradition of describing the interaction among the actors of which are defining the networks in terms of block modeling, and then you can just introduce some measure, which are giving you a rough estimation of how far are or how close is your real system to an idealized structure to an idealized core periphery structure. Can we say that core periphery structure is certainly indicating a deviation from random matching? Yesterday we saw the two most basic modeling of networks in terms of the random network, and then of the preferential attachment. In both cases, in the random network, in the preferential attachment, the matching of two nodes was not related to some attributes of the system, except in the case of the preferential attachment to the degree of the system. but this is this. I mean, can now we are just considering another model, the model of core periphery, and then is this core periphery intrinsically different from the other two? So because we are providing in the definition a classification of the nodes in two groups of nodes, the node of the core and the node of the periphery. The answer is indeed a mixed answer. Why? Because you can have a kind of partition between, let's say, a dense core and a sparse set of nodes. Also, when you just consider essentially a power law, when you consider a degree distribution with a power law. These two mathematicians, Chang and Lu, in 2002, have shown that when you have a degree distribution proportional to k2 minus beta, with this value of beta, which is close to the value, if you remember, of the scale-free distribution, which is 3, you almost sure will obtain a dense subgraph that has a short distance to almost all the other nodes. So this means that and we will see this in the empirical data, in a sense, even if you imagine to build up a scale-free model, like the preferential attachment, by asking the system to grow in terms of random connection controlled only by the degree, indeed you might end up into a structure of the network which is showing the presence of a dense subgraph that you can model in terms of a core that has short distance with the other nodes. In other words, the similarity, there could be a strong similarity between a scale-free network and a core periphery network, in spite of the fact that we can imagine to consider these two topology as distinct topology, and we can construct this topology in completely different ways. Borgatti and collaborator have proposed to estimate as an indicator of the degree of core periphery the overlap between the real adjacency matrix with the idealized adjacency matrix of a core periphery structure. Another scholar, Peter Holm, proposed another coefficient to quantify the core periphery, the similarity of the empirical network, or just grown networks with a core periphery structure, based on the concept of K-core. In the case of K-core, the idea is just to look for the subnetworks that you can obtain by removing all the vertices of degree less than k. So in this example here, with different colors, you can see that, for example, all the nodes are 0 cores, this blue set and all the other colors. When you remove the nodes that have just degree 1, you detect this other set here, and indeed this group here, which are highlighted by these green circles, and these are 1 core. And when you remove the one with degree 2, you end up into this group here. And then for the 3 core, you just will select this click here. By this way, by using this concept of the K-core, you just will detect information about the presence of clicks, large clicks, that certainly are indicators of the presence of a core type structure. So with this measure, you have a better description of K-core, and up to now we have just discussed core periphery structure for undirected network, but we know that in most cases the directionality could be relevant, and in fact there are several networks, and among them the most important network has this characteristic, where indeed you see a core which is not only dense, but which has the characteristic of being, when the network is directed, you observe that this core, it is not only strongly connected, but it is strongly connected. Strongly in the sense that you have the connection that guarantees that the path, the internal path of the connections are direct path. And this is in fact the case, for example, of the World Wide Web. This is the result that you obtain, the result that were obtained in 2000 for the first large-scale investigation of the World Wide Web, which considered the interconnection of 200 million pages and 1.5 billion links. This type of study have been repeated even recently by considering billions of pages and hundreds of billions of links, and this structure is still there. So, but I mean, we are not at the moment interested in this type of big networks, very extremely big networks, but rather we want to focus on the interbank market. So let's go back to the interbank market and let's try to investigate in detail the interbank market. This was done by these two authors, and this is a rather recent work. Craig and von Peter, they wanted to detect the organization in layers of the interbank market, and they worked on a very specific interbank market by having access to the data. They had access to the data because this work was done while one of the authors was working at the Bundesbank. And so the model is the model of the core periphery. So you have banks which are belonging to the core and which are then top-tier banks which are lending the one to the other, lending the one to each other, and then they know also that there are lower-tier banks which do not lend to each other, and so they imagine that they can have a relationship with the core, but not among them. So this is a block representation of the adjacency matrix, indicated with M, with their symbology. So in RR, they require, in this block RR, they require that there is at least one link in every row, just to allow that the banks of the periphery are connected with the bank of the cores. And in CR, they call this a column regular matrix, with again at least one in every column. So it is, I think, it is this setting here, essentially, where there is the requirement of at least one in the column and one in the row. So how to do that? So the idea is to detect from the data, the real data, the structure in core and periphery. So there is not an assignment, an a priori assignment of the banks into the core or the periphery, but rather the interlinkages are detected at some quarterly period, and by using this information, what they define an error score, and the error score is defined like this. ECC is the error in the core, so the absence of the fact that you do not observe a link in the core. EPP is an error in the periphery, which is the presence of an interlinkages in the periphery between two banks which are belonging to the periphery, and this is the absence related from the core to periphery, or to the periphery to the core. So this is the error score that they define, and this is the way they perform the analysis. So they classify the core they make some trials with the computer, they assign some nodes to the core, and then by assigning the node to the core, they detect the errors. When the core is, for example, assigned to the nodes A, B, and C, these three red nodes, you see that here there is the assumption that one node is missing, which means that this is implying an error of the core, because this is missing. And when this is the setting, node D and H are periphery, and this node is an error because it is a director, and this link, the presence of this link is an error because there is a directed interconnection between D and H. So this is another error. So which means that the error score is 2/13, the total number of things, of arcs that you have in the system. You can define a score just node A and B, and with this definition you will have two errors. One is this error here and this other error here, and then this is the score that you obtain for this setting. So by repeating this by computer, you select the best partitioning in terms of nodes that belongs to the core and nodes that belongs to the periphery, and then you obtain the block, the adjacency matrix written in terms of a block matrix. And they were able to investigate the German banking system. It's a banking system involving more than 2,000 banks. They were able to perform a quarterly analysis during the time period from 1999, the first quarter of 1999, to the third quarter of 2012. This is one of the largest banking system with 7.6 trillions in 2007, and the banks were pretty active. Essentially, a large fraction of them were active during this period, and the system is heterogeneous as usual. So, and what was the conclusion? So they analyzed the period from 1999 to 2012. So this period comprises the subprime crisis and then the successive European debt crisis. So they originally decided to focus on a pre-crisis period or time, and what they had in this for this quarter was that they had 2,100,000 banks, and 1,800 were active in the interbank market, and 1,600 acted as intermediary. So they used the term intermediaries because the banks were both lending and borrowing. So the idea that the interbank market is just a market where people are going just to obtain liquidity, it's a simplifying description. It is simplifying because some banks start to act in this market as market makers, in the sense that they act on both sides, both as lending and as borrowers, as lenders and as borrowers. So this is so they had essentially a relatively large system, and then typically for this system, finding the optimal model, core periphery model by numerical search, is a large-scale combinatorial problem, and what they did was just perform a greedy algorithm, starting from a random initial partition. This is what they did to find, let's say, a solution, or just the best solution that they were able to find, and this is what they found. So they found that essentially, it is correct that it is quite good that you use the core periphery modeling for this system. In fact, you obtain a core. Of course, you would obtain in any case a core, but we will see that the core that they obtain is pretty stable over time, so indicating the stability of the procedure. So you have a core of which is relatively small, 45 banks, which are at the core of the system. Then you have a large number of intermediaries, and then you have a number of lenders and borrowers. So the pure lenders, you see, are order 100 banks, and the pure borrowers also order 100 banks. But and then you have that all the banks are lending and borrowing, and a few special ones are constituting the core of the system. So the error score was relatively low. Of course, we don't know, but in terms of the links, it was certainly not so. The discrepancy was small, because only 12% of the links of the network were mismatched with respect to an idealized core periphery structure. And as I said, more importantly, when they repeated this analysis quarter by quarter, the conclusion was that there was a high stability of the core, especially before the setting of the period of financial distress. But also also around 2006, and then 2007 and 2008 and 2009, you see the discrepancy of the core, the deviation from the selected core size of approximately 45 was relatively limited, and the error in the score was maintained around 12%. So this stability and consistency, also observed across the 2006-2007 onset of the financial crisis, seems to suggest that the core periphery model is pretty robust and consistent in the description of the German interbank system. And not only it is stable in number, but it is also stable in composition, of course. So when you see the composition of the specific banks that belongs to the core and to the periphery, and you estimate the conditional probability of observing a given bank in a set S at quarter t, being in the set S prime a quarter t plus 1, you see that the banks remain essentially a bank which is in the core remain in the core, and a bank which is in the periphery stay in the periphery. The transition between the core and the periphery are extremely limited, and also the fact that some banks are leaving the system is also something relatively limited. Why? Because I mean you have some banks goes bankrupt, or just they merge, or they change the legal profile, but these are minor things. In the majority of the case, the system is extremely stable, and the fact that we have a very limited core should not be misunderstood in terms of the banking activity. Of course, these are some very special banks which are doing a lot of activity in the market, although they are just a few. This is the typical situation. We know that in this system, in all financial market system, in complex network, you always have a huge heterogeneity, and you have big players which are doing a lot of things. These are the big players, and we can see that by considering the links. I mean, here we have that we can see that the bulk of the bilateral relationship and credit exposure involve the core. In fact, when we consider the link per block, I mean the links that we observe between among the 45 banks of the core cover just 60% of all the links. But in credit exposure, they cover 34% of the amount of loans. So, and the 26% of the relationship between periphery and core and the 58% relationship between the core and the periphery are covering just 47% and 16% on the credit exposure. So this means that the bank of the periphery obtained 96% of the borrowing in credit supplied by the core, and the periphery just provided this amount of money to the core. So we have the conclusion is that we have a stable core with very active banks which are providing which are doing a lot of credit activity among them and with the periphery. Sometimes they receive liquidity from the periphery to the core. Sometimes they are providing, in the case of the German system, they are preferentially providing liquidity from the core to the periphery. And then one can also make an indicator of the credit volume which is intermediated by the banks, and this end up in showing that the credit volume intermediated by the bank of the core is 75% of the total credit volume. So these are the banks of the core are the banks which are performing the intermediation of the credit in the German system. So the system structures in an heterogeneous way with some big players which are taking the role of market makers at the center of the system. The relationship that we see between banks in the periphery and banks in the core are typically persistent over time. So this is another aspect which should be put in emphasis. Although this is a market, this is, I will say, a networked market. So what is a networked market? It's a market where the type of relationship are not driven by exclusively, let's say, market conditions, but are also related to some trust, or some reflect some memory conditions of the relationship. So when you want to open a credit relationship between two economic actors, then you need a kind of recognition between the two. So in several markets, the lender, of course, is quite careful in selecting the different customers for the loans. So this means that it is important that you have a kind of relationship between the lender and the borrowers, and this is observed in the time analysis of the evolution of the credit relationship in this type of system. We will see that this is also observed not only in the German system, but also in the EMID market, which is an electronic market open to European banks, but primarily used by Italian banks. Okay, I will skip that. And so we have seen that Craig and von Peter have good evidence that the German interbank market can be described in terms of a core periphery structure. But we also have seen that other authors, specifically Boss, Elsinger, Sammer, and Turner, proposed a different type of topology. And the different type of topology for the Austrian system, interbank market, was a topology in terms of scale-free distribution. So, I mean, the German system and the Austrian system are not too different. So, is this meaning that, the two things are similar or different, or just, both are correct or both are wrong? So, we don't know what is the best description, but of course what you can do is just to, in a sense, repeat the approach of Craig von Peter, not only in the real system, but in a system which is just in systems which are just replicas, random replicas of some models, with some of the parameters tuned, calibrated to the German interbank system. So this is the German fit. In this figure, they present the comparison between the German fit against stimulated error score density of random graph and scale-free networks characterized by similar topological metrics. So you see, random graph would have presented error score extremely high. So certainly a random topology is not a correct one, because a random topology is not providing a core periphery structure. But as we saw in terms of the result of Chang and Lu, of the two mathematicians, and as they saw in terms of simulations, when you compare scale-free networks and the real data, or just core periphery simulations, simulation of core periphery models, you have something close on what you observe in the German market. So in other words, discriminating between a scale-free and a core periphery could be quite difficult. The two things can, in a sense, present a structure that is showing the presence of a dense core with interaction to a sparse periphery. The core periphery seems to be a better description, but the scale 3 is not too far from it. So, so what characterized a core bank? Once that they found the 45 banks of the core, yeah, they know the banks, and they can do an attributes analysis on what characterizes a core bank, and they did a regressor in a probability framework, and they analyzed the type of role in the network, and measure of the bank size, and measure of the bank specialization. So they then what they saw that was that there was a role of the systemic importance of being related to the network position, and also role of the betweenness. Of course, if you are contributing if you are doing intermediation, you need to be in a position of the network that will allow you to be central in the exchanges. And as we saw yesterday, this is related to the betweenness of the system. Also, there is a role of the specialization, so it is important that you are able to, that you have some specific type of banks, and this type of, when you have this type of banks, they typically end up in one of the two sets, and the conclusion was that the core banks carry out ledger transactions and perform a ledger fraction of intermediation. We saw that 75% of the intermediation was done in the core, and the banks in the core are then money center banks, which are dominating the wholesale activity in money market. They also, in some time, are providing clearing services and banking services, and act as dealers in several markets. So it's you have specialization, and this specialization ends up with the fact that you have banks which are doing a lot of activity, and certainly this is one of the channels that will give you the possibility to detect systemic important financial institutions. So this can be done when you have bilateral positions. So when you have access as Craig and von Peter did to the information of the bilateral position, you can build up the network at given time interval, and analyzing the network at given time interval, you can compare the network with some reference model, like the core periphery on the scale 3, and once you detect the core or just the systemically important financial institution, you can characterize the systemically important financial institution. This could be extremely important in the analysis of the system. But in other cases, if you are an analyst, let's say, or even if you are, as it was the case in the past, even a central banks which is not, let's say, tracking this type of information, which has not access to this type of information, you can do that. Because typically what you have are not the bilateral information, but just the aggregate information of the asset and liabilities of each bank, but not the bilateral information. So from the balance sheet, you have typically the total interbank asset and the total liabilities. So this is a typical problem, and indeed this is a problem which is often faced when you investigate networks, and this is a typical classic origin-destination problem. So in a lot of flux interaction, you know the global origin destination, but you do not know the specific path. So what, and we will see that, for example, this type of problem is related to what we saw yesterday concerning the international trade network. So what to do when you have when you know when bilateral positions are unknown? What to do? Can you do something? And we know that you can do something. One thing that you can do is just to use the maximum entropy, as we did yesterday, or as the authors did yesterday in the case of the international trade network. So you can imagine that, I mean, you don't know what is the distribution of your degree or of your strength. In this case, it's the strength which is most important. And then you assume that you just divide the amount of the thing, in this case money, that you are distributing with maximal diversification. This is maximum entropy, maximal diversification. And maximum entropy then means that you have the minimum specification of available information. You have only the totals, and you don't know if there are special relationships in the system. So when we have, in general, xij as the element of the matrix, the one that was bij before in the interbank position, you have the asset you have the interbank asset related to bank I and the liability, and then typically what you want to do is just to maximize this quantity here by looking for a solution of the strength matrix, which is indicated with E in this case, under the constraint that you have the correct asset and liability. Sometimes you have part of the information. These Qij are the known bilateral exposure, and this reduce the number of unknowns that you have, or put the constraint on the number of unknowns that you have. So typically, the solution is just of the maximum entropy solution is let's say, dominated by the marginal distribution of the total asset and total liabilities. So the entry of the matrix are proportional to the product of the asset and liability. And but this means that when you use the minimum entropy approach, you are by construction assuming that you are considering a fully connected network, because I mean, or just a fully connected network among all the elements which are presenting asset or liabilities different than zero. So so you are forcing a type of topology on the system when you do that. You are just considering the maximal diversification. Is this something that it is common in again in complex networks? Again, this is certainly not the case of the interbank market, and it is probably even, and we also know that it is not the case for the international trade. So going back to the example of yesterday, this means that when you use the maximum entropy to have a null hypothesis describing the strength of the export and the import in the international trade, you are forcing the system to have a null hypothesis with full network, something which is not observed in reality. So it could be that it may be worth to move to some other modeling. And what kind of modeling? In the case of the international trade network, we haven't a suggestion. But in the case of the interbank market, we might have another limit case of a null model. And the limit case of the null model that makes sense in the interbank network is what Anand, Craig, and von Peter called the minimum density method. So they propose to consider the exactly opposite case of the maximum entropy. In the case of the maximum entropy, you consider the maximal distribution on all the banks that you have in the system. But Craig and von Peter and Anand said, but you can have also the opposite case. In the opposite case, you have some cost in evaluating whether the counterpart is indeed a counterpart which is solid and which then you can trust, and because you have some, let's say, because you need to know their current status, so you need to invest in knowing what is their current situation. So this has a cost. So and then it is rational to think that I try to minimize the investigation or the analysis of the counterparties. Minimizing the counterparty means that you are, instead of having the spreading of the quantity to all the nodes, you will just look to divide your the quantity that you want to lend or to borrow to the minimum number of the counterparties. And in fact, they call their method minimum density method. So it's something which is going in the opposite direction of the maximum entropy. So the point here is just to minimize this cost C of selecting counterparties under the constraints of having the correct value for the asset and liabilities. So this is done again with an optimization process. They optimize this objective function, which is a function of the number of different interconnection that you realize, and which depends on the error that you put in terms of the distribution of the asset and liabilities with all the other banks. And so this means that the algorithm has some steps, some computational steps. It is an heuristic algorithm, so it is a kind of greedy algorithm. So your different realization can provide a different output. Is stochastic, and it has and each optimization process will provide a certain value of the objective function. The result could be, as usual in these cases, showing the existence of several local minima, and then you can have solutions which are almost equivalent but slightly different. And here, just to summarize, I'm just presenting an example just to clarify what's happening. Let's imagine that, what you have is just the knowledge of the aggregate information about asset and liability. So what you have is this, and this plot at the left bottom part. This is what you have, this information here. And you would like to discover the true network, which is this one here. So if you use the maximum entropy solution, so typically what you do, with the exception of the information related to the fact that the asset of this element was exactly zero and the liabilities of these two was exactly zero, so with the exception of this, what you do when you perform the maximum entropy solution is just to consider all the possibility of spreading the asset and liability with respect to all the others elements of the system. So, and this is the solution. So, for example, the element between A and F is 0.74, which is related to the product of the asset times the liability divided the total value. So, and this is what you observe for the maximum entropy, something around this uniform spreading of the asset and liabilities. When you look for the minimum density, you do something opposite. So what you do is just to limit as much as you can the allocation of the asset and liability to a few banks. So, and both models are far from reality. In one case, you are spreading more than you should. In the other cases, you are just considering the highest localization of your asset and liability that you can. Okay, so in a case you have a concentration of value, and the other case you have a spreading of the values. In the case of Craig and von Peter, they had the real case, so they were able to compare the two models with reality. In general, if you don't know, you have just the two opposite cases, and not the real information, which means that, and in this plot, they essentially show the Lorentz curve for the three cases as a fraction of the total number of links of the original network. In terms of all the possible links, this green dashed line should end for a value of the links, which are all the possible total links. You see that reality is intermediate between the two, but certainly, the degree of inequality and heterogeneity observed in reality is between this model of maximum density and of minimum density and the model of maximum entropy. And they, in this way, were able also to in a sense, generalize the approach of the minimum density by using a kind of parameter which was providing some flexibility on the allocation of the assets and liabilities. With this lambda less than 1, they built they found an allocation of asset and liability that was not as extreme as the minimum density, but was still pretty far from the maximum entropy in terms of the density, degree, assortativity, and all the other indicators. So this was, in a sense, and with this approach, they were able to obtain a modeling of the system, which was they were obtaining a reconstruction of the weighted adjacency matrix, which was not too far from the true network, with some exception. You see that, their model was not able, for example, to reproduce the clustering local average with this modeling. Okay, I think I will skip. So, in the last 10 minutes, I would like to present a study that we did in my group in collaboration with the group of Giulia Iori from City University, in which we analyzed another interbank market empirically, which is the EMID market. EMID is an electronic venue where you can do interbank loans at an European level. It is primarily used by Italian banks, and indeed I will present a result about Italian banks, but it was used also by other large European banks until primarily 2006, and then it has again been used after 2012. But I will present a result between January 1999 and December 2009, so for this reason our investigation was focused on the Italian banks. We analyzed just overnight credit relationship, and we analyzed in a separate way loans that were closed by a lender and loans that were closed by a borrower. So in the data you have information about who was the originator of the loan, if this was proposed by at the end by the lender or by the borrower. This was done just to make or to analyze in a separate way the role of the lender or the borrower. Why this analysis is interesting? It is interesting because first of all, it can be done by using concept of network theory again. So, and in fact, when you maintain the distinction between the lender and the borrower, you can describe this system in terms of a bipartite system. You have lending banks and borrowing banks, and the credit relationship is the link. Of course, a bank could be both lending and borrowing, so they can take place in one of the two. But when they act as borrowers are borrowers, and when they act as lenders are lenders. And our aim was to perform a statistical validation of the overexpression of the relationship. So what was observed by Craig and von Peter concerning the stability of the relationship between the periphery and the core is something that you can validate in a statistical way. Can you see that there are overexpression and underexpression in the repeated relationship, loan relationship in the interbank market? These are electronic data, and these are data which can be accessed, publicly accessed, even if you need to buy it, of course. And then we can perform a statistical test. And the idea was to put the repeated loans, the analysis of repeated loans in terms of an earn problem. And this can be done. Why? Because we have the total number of transactions. We have the information about the total number of transactions in a given time horizon. The time horizon are what they call technically a maintenance period, a period of roughly 3 months. So you have the number of transactions of a bank as a borrower, the number of transactions of a bank J as a borrower, the number of transactions of a bank I as a lender, and then you see how many of them have been done by the two, and you can ask what is the probability of observing X when you have a total number of transactions N, M transaction of bank J as a borrower, and K transaction of bank I as a lender. This can be put in terms of a Horn problem, and an approximate solution is given by the hypergeometric distribution. You can estimate overexpression and underexpression. And when you do that, you are doing this for all the relationship. And when you do for all the relationship, this means that you are doing a lot of tests. And then you need what is called the multiple hypothesis test correction. you can have or the most severe one, which is called the Bonferroni, or a less demanding correction, which is called a correction which is controlling the false discovery rate, and we use it both, I think. And here I'm just showing the Bonferroni network. So the different circles are banks. The size of the node is related to the size in terms of the number of transactions done, and you see that there are links which are in blue. These are just only the validated links. So you have a dense relationship, but among all the relationship, you can select part of them, which are certainly overexpressed in blue or underexpressed in red, which means that some of the relationships are occurring more frequently than expected in terms of the null hypothesis of taking into account the heterogeneity of the system. Because, I mean, again, we know that some of them are doing a lot of transaction, some other are just doing less transaction. So you have, in some cases, an excess of transaction, and in other cases, a relative absence of transaction in terms of the heterogeneity of the system. So there are links which are avoided and links which are preferentially taken, which means that you have a preferential trading relationship in the interbank market. So this is something that it is putting evidence on the fact that when you do this type of credit relationship, you need a reciprocal agreement on that, which means that the lender must devote some efforts in evaluating the robustness of the creditor, and this is typically obtained in normal times over time, and it requires investment that force to the system to observe less interconnection than the one that you observe. This could be due to the specialization, like in the German case, or could be due to the building of trust, like in the immediate Italian cases. And we did this over time, and here there is the conclusion that we observed for the percentage of links observed in the Bonferroni network. So in the network of the overexpressed credit relationship, and what we saw that, I mean, the ratio, I mean, these systems are dynamical systems. So the original network had a number of links which was decreasing, especially after the crisis, during the crisis, starting from the crisis, which is again is starting in 2006, 2007. You see that there is a decline, but the number of overexpression and also the number of underexpression was essentially constant, which means that in percent we had an increase from, let's say, a plateau of approximately 2% or 4% to something close to 8% around the period of the Lehman bankruptcies, which means that, or which is indicating that especially in stressed periods, it is very important that to control the type of reciprocal knowledge between lender and borrower, which are acting in an interbank market. And perhaps I think it is time to stop here. Thank you for your attention. Question? Yeah?
Yes. Quick question. I got an impression that sometimes, if you consider lending and borrowing banks, it might be important to look at the time, because one bank might borrow from another, but with a certain time scale, and with a different time scale, the relationship could change. So basically, if you just net the liabilities, you can take it zero. But if you consider, especially the crisis time, it might be important to look at the time. So what would be your approach then? If you look at such a network, how would you approach the different time and liabilities?
This type of analysis, essentially, these analyses were done at the end of the quarter. So some of the national banks have information, I think, weekly, but this is, from what I know, I mean,
no, I mean a bit different thing.
Yeah, you mean
One
that?
bank
You
might-
mean that? I mean, some of the relations could be missed because they can be weighted.
No, not that. Certain bank might have a liability that expires next year, but at the same time, this bank might have an asset that he's going to get in a couple of years from the same counterparty. But so if you just net them, it's going to be zero. But if you consider the risks, if you consider the default risk, it might become important, the timing factor.
Yeah, I mean, in this case, it is very important. Important two things. One is just the complete profile of the portfolio, and the other is the time structure of the maturities. And of course, I mean, these are very difficult things in the sense that you need to know this type of information, which are typically unknown. Again, so this is putting a degree of complexity also on top on that. I mean, this is just, in this case, there is this simplification that you are just considering, say that the most important family of assets are just with a typical maturity which is given. So this is something that in general it is not granted. I mean, I agree, but this is just showing that the system is extremely complex, even more complex than I have shown. Yeah. Okay. Other question? Okay. Thank you.